Senator Dean, there are a number of senators who wish to ask questions. Are you prepared to take some questions?
I would be happy to accept questions, Your Honour. Thank you.
Senator Carignan.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. There are a lot of questions that come to mind. Senator, particularly with respect to young people under age 18, between 12 and 18 years of age, the criminal code, because we do agree we're talking about the criminal code, because all of the changes made to legislation will be affected by the criminal law, by the criminal code. And with the prohibitions, I read it is prohibited for any young person to possess a total quantity of cannabis beyond 5 grams of dried cannabis of any category. So in terms of interpreting it the other way around, it would mean that a young person between 12 and 18 years of age could have 5 or less grams with respect to the place, in a private place or a public place. A school is a public place. So here's my question. Are you aware that in this bill you would be allowing minors under 18 years of age to have cannabis in the schools? Don't answer that it's the Youth Criminal Justice Act that would apply here. It is not that law, that act that would apply in terms of taking away the offense.
You know, and look, we're here talking about Bill C-45 today because we're all concerned about the widespread consumption of cannabis by our children and young people. So the starting point, of course, is that young people in Canada between 12 and 18 are consuming cannabis today in significant quantities, and they're being harmed as a result of that. One of the harms, aside from the medical harms, relates to criminalisation and criminal records. One of the stated goals of C-45 is to reduce the impact of criminalisation and to recognise that young people are already consuming in significant quantities, and the 5-gram allowance was designed to provide for an allowance for those young people who today and who may continue after today to be in possession of small amounts of cannabis, to be subject to yes, enforcement, advice, public education, much more so than they're getting today about the harms associated with that, but not to criminalise them. Now, I mentioned in my statement that one of the stated goals of the government is to reduce or eliminate, in fact, the use of cannabis by young people. The latitude to reduce the 5-gram allowance was given to provinces with the encouragement that the overall policy position of the government was to bring down and eliminate, if possible, the use of cannabis by young people. Provinces, certainly our large provinces, have responded to that, and they're eliminating the 5-gram allowance so that the use of cannabis by those people under 18 would not include a free pass, if I could call it that, with 5 grams. Now, the penalty structure of the law is such. Senator Carignan. Senator Carignan, I'm responding to your question here. The penalty structure of C-45 is a sliding scale from a warning or taking away small amounts of cannabis from young people all the way through ticketing and including the implementation of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, but there will be discretion at the provincial level in keeping with the severity of the offence.
Il y a beaucoup de sénateurs qui
There are many senators, Senator Carignan, who would like to ask questions. I will come back to you if we have time.
I thank the honourable senator for what I thought to be a very thorough and almost convincing speech. And this is a matter that has preoccupied Houses of Parliament and members for quite some time. So I wonder, and I also note for those of us who sit on the National Finance Committee, that the estimates of the current set of estimates that will be coming before us as a supply bill very shortly listed a sum of money in the amount of $39 million, almost $40 million, for the Federal Department of Health to provide a regulatory framework for cannabis. That I questioned, but that's for another day, not today. Today, my question to you is about consumption of cannabis and the fact that this bill C-45 will provide for the medicinal use of cannabis. I hear this a lot, the medicinal use of cannabis. I'm just wondering, Senator Dean, if you've given any thought to the use of medicine in this way, historically and traditionally, and the pharmaceutical companies are there to prove this. Most medicines are delivered by pills, capsules, injections, and other ways. I know of no medicine that is delivered by smoking. I know of absolutely no medicine that is ever delivered by smoking. And smoking, as you know, is a process whereby human beings are breathing into their bodies from actual burning materials which are deadly to the human body, as we know. So I just wonder if you could amplify this notion of medicinal use by smoking, because no medicine is delivered by smoking.
Senator Coles, you've identified a further harm of cannabis, which is a rather obvious one. First of all, thanks for the question. Almost convincing. I'll take that at first pass on this bill. So first, the current medical regime, which is, as I've said, has been tremendously successful, and which, to be fair, we should give due credit to the former government and its leader for successfully implementing that. That will not be changed by this legislation. The medical regime will operate in parallel, although there are similarities. Any ingestion that involves burning carbons is by its nature unhealthy and is known to cause serious injury. We know that from tobacco. Tobacco, of course, has the additional highly addictive problems of nicotine. So absolutely, smoking is a harm, and the more people smoke, the greater the harm. The more that tobacco is added to cannabis product, the harm increases because of tobacco use and because of the introduction of nicotine. For this reason, I know that many medical producers produce edible products, and that they produce oil that can be used to make edible products. And edible products aren't, of course, within the ambit of the discussion we're having now. That is moved off for a year. So, there are some things that can be moved downstream for later consideration, obviously. The government has clearly been open to that. And so that raises the question of the edible products world, and then leads us very, very quickly to packaging and regulation and labeling, and the benefits of clearly labeled doses. So what we have in the medical regime is something we don't have in the illicit regime. Today we have in the medical regime clearly identified THC levels, CBD levels, clearly identified potency. All the things that isn't available in that $7 billion illicit market. And remember, Canada's recreational market is fed by a 100% illicit supply. So as we think about shifting to a legal regime, we can think about free from the constraints of criminalisation. We can start talking about harm reduction. We can start putting a community health and public lens on this, which was actively discouraged, which has been actively discouraged under the criminalisation regime. And we can start to talk about the harms of cannabis, the harms of smoking, and the harms of cannabis in general. There is no doubt there are therapeutic effects. We could also learn from the packaging, labelling, quality control, and potency control that have been well tested, well developed in Canada as we shift over, if we shift over, to a legal regime. It's not a cold start. Our producers know how to do it. They're sophisticated, and people are coming from around the world to see how it's done here. Thank you, Senator Coons.
Senator Dean, your time has expired, but I know there are a number of senators who want to ask questions still. Are you asking for 5 more minutes to entertain a few more questions?
1 hour.
Sorry.
Your Honour, as you will know, I have promoted the notion of the more discussion and debate in this chamber, the better. So of course I remain open to questions.
Is leave granted, honourable senators? Okay, to those senators who are going to ask questions, if you want to enter the debate, take your 15 minutes when the questions are over and enter the debate. But if you want to ask a question, please keep it short so that we can get as many senators in as possible. Senator Raine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question... Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be short. Does Senator Dean expect there will be more Canadians using marijuana after it is legalized or fewer? Thank you.
Senator Dean.
Thank you for the question. The policy proposals in front of us recognise that there are likely in the millions of Canadians using cannabis today. Step 1 is reducing the harms associated with that. It's about reducing the degree of consumption, particularly among young people. It's about reducing the intensity of their use. It's about advising them and educating them on the reasons why they shouldn't. I believe that in its mature sense, some years down the road, that as a result of better enforcement, and there's lots of money for enforcement in this policy initiative, better education, where we are going to see, and we should see, fewer Canadians than today using cannabis and using it more safely and with a far better sense, risk-informed sense, of the problems they may be taking on. I can tell you this. What we know is by doing nothing and looking the other way, I can guarantee those rates will increase. I can guarantee it. And I don't want to do that.
My question has to do with Canada's international treaty obligations relating to marijuana, an issue you have unfortunately not covered in your presentation. As you know, Canada is a signatory to 3 United Nations drug control conventions. The conventions date back to 1961, 1971, and 1988. They generally prohibit the use of marijuana other than for medical or scientific purposes. Assuming Bill C-45 becomes law, how will Canada deal with its international treaty obligations? Will it seek or make reservation to remove the marijuana provisions of those treaties, propose amendments to the terms of the conventions, or simply withdraw from the conventions if its requests are refused? In other words, avoid legalizing marijuana in a way that violates Canada's international obligations. My understanding is that so far, Canada has done none of those, and this is rather unfortunate, and I'd like to have your thoughts on that, please.
Dean.
Thank you. It's a terrific question, and I'm very pleased to be able to respond to it. Look, first of all, Senator, I leave the question of the management of international treaty obligations to those responsible within government. There are a number of ways, and you've identified some of them, that the government could choose to address this. I will simply say this today. I've looked at those treaty obligations, and I am convinced that the current approach to cannabis criminalisation in Canada is clearly in violation of its treaty obligations to reduce the use of cannabis and to tackle illicit drug markets. We can't do any worse, Senators, than we're doing with cannabis today in being responsive to our international treaty obligations. We can only do better. This is an approach that I think would do better. But that is a terrific question, and I wasn't avoiding it in my statement. I was hoping somebody would ask me.
Your time has expired again, Senator Dean, but I see there's at least one other question.
The more time,
Leave
the better,
granted.
Your Honour.
Senator Patterson.